with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Thanks so much for checking in wherever you are in the world. Today, I have a returning guest. She was one of the original guests of Phronesis back in 2020, probably April or May of 2020, Susan. We have Dr. Susan Murphy. She is Chair of Leadership Development in the Business School at the University of Edinburgh. She was formerly Director of the School of Strategic Leadership Studies at James Madison University and Professor of Leadership Studies. She has published in Leadership Quarterly, Organizational Behavior, Human Decision Making, Journal of Vocational Behavior, Journal of Business and Psychology, and the Journal of Applied Psychology. And she is in Scotland. And, I was reflecting on this, Susan, probably, it's a good 15 years ago. We had about 7 to 10 days in Scotland where we bounced. My friend was working in Aberdeen. He was working for an oil company. And so you can imagine us bouncing around. And we ended up in this pub in Glasgow called Bobbity Bowster. And it was one of the best afternoons I've ever had. We met the owner. His name was Fraser. And he said, "Where are you from?" We said, "The States." And he said, "Oh, how long have you been here?" We said, "About 7 days." He said, "I bet you've been bouncing around, spending no more than 5 minutes in any one location, right?" And we said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you're going to sit here today." And I think we'd arrived around 2. And we watched a football match and a rugby match, and then a bunch of musicians showed up around 7, and I think I was in bed by about 8:30.
That sounds like very much Scotland hospitality for sure. It's a very unique place, and it's beautiful. It is beautiful. Yeah.
Oh,
My kids love it here. Yeah,
just gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Well, Susan, thank you so much for checking back in, and I know that as we were kind of talking about what we could discuss today, you have strategic thinking on your mind. And so I'm excited for this conversation. Haven't had an episode specifically geared towards this specific topic, but obviously it is an activity that leaders are engaged in all day long. And so where would you like to begin? What are some kind of foundational concepts that listeners should be aware of as we begin the conversation about strategic thinking? What do you think?
That's a good question. I think strategic thinking. I started here at the University of Edinburgh now 10 years ago, and we have as one of our signature courses strategic leadership. And so, what is it that strategic leaders are responsible for? And so, typically, when you think of a strategic leader, you think of the CEO and sort of the C-suite. Maybe regional high-level managers, but maybe not in the rest of the organization. But as organizations have become more complex with lots more uncertainty and probably more customer driven, you find that more people need to be thinking about what's going to happen in my part of the organization 5 years, 10 years down the road. How can I set a vision that my team sort of gets around so that we can make the changes we need to remain competitive? So that's kind of the start was in that area of strategic leadership. And then strategic thinking, as a psychologist, I've always been interested in how people think. I think many of us were inspired by the work on biases by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. We always like to brag about them because they're also psychologists and economists. And you don't see psychologists winning the Nobel Prize too often. So that's kind of cool. And so, I think as an undergraduate and even a graduate student, this idea that we don't make decisions by kind of weighing the pros and the cons in a rational way, that we typically have those biased ways of looking at information. This is big today, right? Because with the internet, social media, we actually get a feed that builds on our bias of looking for things that confirm our already existing ideas.
Yes.
So as a business leader, you can't think that way. You can't be sitting around a table and thinking so uncritically that you're only looking for information that confirms what you've already thought. So top level managers today really struggle with, how do I get my people thinking sort of more innovatively, more creatively, and more strategically? And a lot of times that requires a bit of futurizing. That's a new word I've sort of made up lately. I don't know if anyone else uses it, but the future, I had met this academic colleague probably 20 years ago or so, and he studied mentoring, and he also was a futurist. I said, how does one become a futurist? And he said, you just really look at trends and you look at the kinds of things people are talking about and where things are going. And he says, you need to be in that anticipatory space within an organization. So you think about something like AI recently, AI has been chugging along for years and years. I mean, we had a Steven Spielberg movie called AI. It wasn't until probably like a month ago when people started getting the attention of Chat GPT and the level of things that it could recreate when you would ask it specific kinds of questions that were quite good. And I think now AI, which has taken a while, is part of our future. And then that's what you ask companies. What if you had a chat bot to run your leadership development program? So what if you typed into Chat GPT, develop for me 3 different streams of leader development for these different kinds of employees? What would you include, etc.? So that idea of, I think we're afraid of the future sometimes, and so we don't think about what it might mean. And so strategic thinking is a bit about, pulling your head up, watching out for biases, some of these other things, pretending you're the futurist.
I love it. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's, there's a couple parts in there, but let's stick on some of these cognitive biases. What are there?
Okay.
Susan? Are there like 170 of them that have been identified, right?
Well, I think there are, but there's also this wheel I often use in the classroom, which is called 360 degrees of bias. So some of them are sort of proactively how you're looking for information. So do you look for confirming information or easy to find information or information that everybody's agreeing with? There's a lot of studies around shared information, for example, in operating rooms. If everybody's agreeing and the lone person says, wait, I don't think we should do that because I think something else is going on, that person will often be ignored. So there's a bias towards what everyone in the group is believing, and that actually could be wrong. And so you have to kind of weigh the 2 different ideas, even though the frequency of thinking in that way is disparate and everything. And then there's the ones that are kind of, I think, in, the hindsight biases. You look at something and say, oh, we should have known, or, I mean, maybe it's a little bit similar to Monday morning quarterbacking, that idea when you go to the water cooler on Monday and talk about how the game went and everything. But there are so many, and I used to study a lot of social cognitive psychology. And so I was always curious about when we do leadership ratings, for example, what we'd call the similar to me bias. You'd be rated as a good team member or a good leader if you were similar to your leader. And so you had that kind of affinity in the ratings that would come out. So we just know there's so many little nuanced pieces you can do to change the way people view information. And so, yeah, there's quite a few. I don't know if there's really 360, but I do like the wheel.
I sometimes will talk about some of these in some of my sessions or in the classroom. And
What's your favorite?
I really love inattentional blindness. there's and I'm going to put it in the show notes for listeners to click
Okay.
on. There's a great video online. It's called Who Done It. You're zoomed into this little murder mystery, and all of a sudden you kind of finish it, you push pause, and you say, did anyone notice anything about this video? And literally, bears were there at the beginning, and
Yeah.
21 things changed in front of their eyes. Literally
Yeah.
21 things. And then they show you the
Yeah.
part of the video where all the things that are changing, and people are just kind of blown away. And then
Yeah.
you've seen and I'll put this in the show notes as well. There's a little paragraph about a doctor working on a patient, and you kind of woo people into the conceptual block that doctors are men. And literally
Yes.
every
Yeah.
time, the
Yes.
doctor is actually the person's mother,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
most people, half at least, even
Yeah.
in healthcare, Susan,
Yes. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
their
Yeah.
minds don't see it. So I
Yeah.
always do a couple of those types of activities just to say, look, we are all
Right.
limited, and we have to enter this conversation with a level of humility. And it's so funny that video with the bear and the suit of
Yeah.
armor. It starts with a
Yeah.
bear, like a stuffed bear in the corner, and then it changes
Yeah.
to a suit of armor. And I was in an organization last year, and it was the first day the interns were there. So I showed the video. I said, "Did you notice anything?" And this intern on his first day said, "Well, I saw a bear change to a suit of armor." And the grizzled employees looked back and said, "There wasn't a bear. What are you saying, right?" And it was just this great example of, yeah, I mean, we have to enter this with a kind of a sense of humility and a humble curiosity that we're limited and we need
Yeah.
others and
Yeah.
need to work with
Yeah.
others, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, and I don't want to pick on Gen X maybe, but as people sort of age too, because from cognitive psychology, you kind of have those structures in your brain that you don't let in new information because you've already got the schema about what something looks like. So that
Yes.
bear doesn't even register because you've had years of experience where there would never be a bear there. There would never be a suit of armor. Why am I even looking at that? But somebody new to an organization who's like taking in as much as they possibly can would be very vigilant in looking for those nuanced things. And I think sometimes that's where you have the generational clashes in the workplace because Gen Z will come in really excited and really have those like literal new set of eyes to see things that maybe you haven't seen before. And that's why people do need to listen to one another. Maybe Gen Z though gets really distracted by lots of different things, and so Gen X can kind of help them sort of focus and everything. But I think that's why it does take teams on these processes, and that's actually the next module in a course I'm doing for a company here in Scotland is about how to bring strategic thinking to the rest of your team. So we've been
Nice.
working with the leaders on that portion.
Well, because I imagine then, is the leader, and you've seen this plenty of times, is the individual, the person in the position of authority, creating a space where people feel like they have voice,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Oof.
Exactly. Sometimes people will talk about that in terms of psychological safety. Can you bring up new ideas? But even in maybe what I'd consider a relatively safe environment, you still run into the issue of either the manager sort of driving the conversation and sort of constraining it,
Yep.
maybe unintentionally because they're not thinking as broadly as maybe some of the others in the group, or the group members are so attuned to what the manager is saying, they sort of try to, with that mirroring of what his or her thoughts are. And so, one of the things that we are working on with them is sort of what we call it's kind of like in coaching conversations where you don't solve the problem, but you ask really good questions.
Yes.
And with your own opinions, you sort of hedge a bit rather than saying, I know for 100% sure that our market share is going to decrease. You say, from the data I've examined, I kind of see this trend. What do the
Mm,
rest of you think? Do you see the data similarly, or if you were someone else, how would you see it differently? So really interrogating them about their sort of thoughts and getting them to think on their own versus having to lockstep behind the leader's thought processes.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then,
Yeah.
you had mentioned something so wonderful. I mean, we kind of dipped our toes into this chat GPT space.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's very, very fascinating to me. Been doing I've been running a course, Susan, for the last 5 years now on kind of the future
Yeah.
of work. And we take students to an organization like Goodyear or Key Bank. It might be a Fortune 500, or it could be a startup. What's fascinating about some of those conversations is that oftentimes when I'm having these conversations in organizations, people are not aware of those trends. There's maybe a couple people in the
Yes.
organization who
Yeah.
are always like the person from IT or their digitization group is like, yeah, we get this. Yeah, we know all
Yeah.
about blockchain. Yeah, we know all about sensor
Yeah.
technology. Yes, we know about, but
Yeah.
they don't have a room filled with people who know about those different technologies and how they're being leveraged
Right.
in banking or in
Yeah.
healthcare.
Because you'll have people, I asked a couple of companies recently, and they'll say, oh yeah, our business intelligence group sort of deals with that a bit, but it's how do they bring that back to the organization then? Yeah. So one of the other things I sort of focus on when we do strategic thinking is something I picked up recently, which is called ecosystem mapping.
Hmm.
Because I teach a course on strategic leadership, and I always use Mary Barra at GM because I find her to be really a fascinating leader. I mean, she
Yes.
comes into GM when they know they're going in front of Congress for the ignition switch problem that
Yes.
wasn't her fault, but
Yep.
she's got to be there talking about how she'll guarantee going forward that they're not going to harm people. So that's good. But one of the
That's helpful.
things that's helpful. One of the things that she did, and imagine talking to your shareholders. I do another case too with Indira Nuri at PepsiCo, and
Yes.
she too
Yes.
was kind of changing the nature of the organization from just as they famously said one time, selling bottled sugar water to sustainability concerns and et cetera, et cetera. But Mary Barra, when you map the ecosystem, there's two things affecting cars right now. One is kind of the ownership model.
Hmm.
Because of increased urbanization, many young kids even aren't getting driver's licenses today.
Yes.
They're going to live in urban areas where maybe they'll get a car eventually, maybe they'll share it with someone, maybe they'll rent it in some sort of way. So GM's kind of moved to thinking about these new ways of maybe cities are going to own cars like city bikes and things like that, where you take them out. And then the other piece is technology. She says GM has always been a technology company. Think of OnStar. Think of how
Hmm.
long ago that OnStar
Yeah.
service was,
Yeah.
linking to that. So she says, if you think about it as technology and new ownership models, that opens you up to a new ecosystem where you're thinking about things like cyber criminals. Can
Yes.
cyber criminals hack into our cars? There's actually a
Yes.
book called Passengers where somebody hijacks these cars, and it goes on from there. But so it's just quite So how did she move from kind of this tech company and then also go full force into automated driving as well as EV? And I don't even know if you know this. Do you know what GM has gone into now? Their newest thing is
No, no, what is it?
GM Energy.
Oh, wow.
So when you have a charger at your home for your car, that charger would also help you if the electricity went out because of a snowstorm, a tornado, a hurricane, whatever else happens in the US. And so they're providing energy in that way. So every technology is also being leveraged. So they're very connected. They're thinking of themselves much differently, but they've brought along all of their stakeholders. And that's the other piece in strategic thinking is sometimes you can get ahead of yourself.
Hmm.
They use the example of Kodak. They invented digital photography
Yes.
basically, but they couldn't get the shareholders and the rest of the stakeholders to even say that was what they did. And so they kind of missed that opportunity because they weren't defined in that way. But I think the whole area of strategic thinking is just fascinating because there's so much work to be done. And some companies are doing a good job, and some companies one day fall asleep
Yes.
losing the signal. The book Losing the Signal about BlackBerry is a perfect example. Yeah. Anyway, but it is
I
fascinating.
was
Yeah.
I was in LA working with an
Yeah.
organization last fall, and I looked up at a building and it said
Yeah.
BlackBerry on it, Susan. And I thought,
Yes.
wow,
Yeah.
they still
I think that's
exist.
in, I don't know if that's in Century City or in Westwood.
That was
I
in,
remember seeing
well,
that
I was
building.
in Irvine,
Yeah.
but
Oh, maybe.
it
Yeah. Yeah.
was-
Yeah. That's pretty funny. And
Oh,
you
wow.
said what? Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
BlackBerry.
yeah,
Huh.
exactly.
Well, it
Yeah,
is. It's
exactly.
fascinating, and at least how I kind of communicated sometimes is, do we have at
Yeah,
least a workforce that is somewhat tech fluent? They are not the individuals coding or not the
yeah,
individuals, but are they
correct.
aware of what are these trends and what's happening in the ecosystem and what's specifically happening on the margins? There's so many
Yeah,
people like fintechs, for example, kind of nipping at the large financial institutions, and you've got big
yeah,
tech also that is really trying to
yeah,
enter that space as well of
yeah,
financial services,
yeah.
Apple or Amazon.
And that's the question we ask people sometimes. Like,
Yes.
what if Google started building houses? We're working with a house building company. I said to people the other day, I said, what if Google started distributing water? What would they have over you that you don't have as a water distributor?
Hmm.
Those kinds of questions. Yeah, yeah, can get
Oh, I
people
love
thinking like
that.
that.
I love that
Yeah,
because
yeah. Just say it. Just use it.
yeah, I will. I'll steal that.
Yeah, good.
Whether it's Amazon or Google or some of these large tech organizations, Microsoft, IBM, they have, again, think of relatively how quickly IBM moved into healthcare. Now they've run into some challenges there. It didn't, I think, turn out to be everything they'd hoped it would. But some of these organizations pivoting into, well, Amazon has pivoted into healthcare and prescription medications, and they're using some
Hmm.
of the base
Hmm.
technology of AI and some other functionalities that basically their expertise can be leveraged in a new domain and they can enter pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, yeah. But it is, I mean, but if you have a workforce who kind of says, "Oh, that's not who we really are. That's not what we really do," and are afraid of those changes, it can be problematic. IBM too has introduced AI in their human resource function, and
Hmm.
what's been interesting about that is they probably reduced their HR function now by 30%.
Hmm.
So a lot of the more mundane processing or question answering is taken care of by chatbots now. The hiring, the skill matrices, all that sort of stuff is, they're moving more towards, human assisted sort of AI. But yes, I think, it's not strategic thinking, but if you're not thinking this way, like how is AI going to disrupt my business? I think it's really important. But I think there's a lot more AI than people think about on a day-to-day basis, for sure. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
it's just Chat GPT woke everyone up from their
Well,
slumber.
it's definitely a game changer. And I've been listening to a few
Yeah.
podcasts lately with some of the
Yeah.
folks. I forget the gentleman who wrote the textbook. I think he's at Berkeley. Stuart Russell might be his name, but some
Oh,
podcast
I don't know
episodes
that
with
guy.
him recently, and even some of the concerns he's having about, as we move from like a narrow AI where you have
Yeah.
a software that can play Go or can play chess or can elevate the
Correct.
algorithm
Yeah.
of what you're going to click next because it's an article about why that,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
more of a general artificial general intelligence and some of the concerns around ethics. And but again, to your overall point, are we looking at these trends and are we kind of scanning the landscape and thinking like a futurist would? What would happen if Google entered this
Yeah.
space?
So sometimes I think, and I have sort of an idea around some of the foundational skills that it takes to be a good strategic thinker. And one of those, I mean, they all kind of get down to psychology ones, like the need for cognitive closure.
Hmm.
The people who've got to make the snap judgments, and snap judgments are good maybe in a crisis situation, or when it's something quite mundane, but when it's something bigger, to sort of close off the decision making process, because not only do you want to make a decision quickly, but you're uncomfortable with the uncertainty an undecided decision leaves, that you're going to kind of force it. So that's one of the things we talk a lot about, is how do you sort of suspend that difficulty with not knowing what's going to happen. So people do scenario planning, of course, and then they might think about the probabilities of those different scenarios to just kind of relax. And you'll know the kind of people you work with. Like, I'm a person who doesn't like to shut anything down until the last possible moment. Like, I have almost zero need for closure.
Yeah.
sometimes, sometimes when I'm submitting a bill payment, I don't go through the three levels of submitting because I'm already done on the first submit or something like that. So I've no, my closure isn't even there. It's like I superficially look, but the idea there too is you'll have people who want to shut things down. So you always need that mix of people, and they have to kind of learn from one another too, because you can't leave things up in the air forever. But so that need for cognitive closure, a comfortableness with uncertainty. I know the Korn Ferry assessment that I use is big on that, and you can really see the difference. It's a big skill that people need in organizations. The
Hmm.
other one too is kind of the divergent thinking. I
Yeah.
do one of the multiple uses tasks for my students, and so I say to them, I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and I show them a picture of our red classic U.S. brick, and I say you have 2 minutes to come up with as many uses as you can for this brick. And so
Hmm.
then they go, 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 go. And so I've been doing this for a few years, and the most I've ever got is maybe 18
Yeah.
answers. But the least are around six. So the difference between 6 and 18 are kind of startling. So I have the class sort of share. And what you hear from the people who only could come up with six answers were this really constrained thinking around, well, I thought you could only use it for building because it was a brick. I thought that would be the rules. And so I was just
Yes.
trying to follow the rules. And the other people were using it as artwork, door stops, just this list of things. And you could see the people who had only six or seven, their eyes would open wide and say, wow, I never
Yes.
thought about. I had a student come up to me afterwards and say, how do people think like that? Seriously, how can we kind of open our minds? And I just said, think no rules, think
Hmm.
crazy, think and I think that's like kind of in the whole idea of ideation a bit, that whole design thinking sort of modeling too. But those are the basic psychological skills, I think, in some ways, as being a creative thinker, divergent thinker, not having to need cognitive closure too quickly, and then also the idea of just sort of dealing with uncertainty and probably paradox, as you talked about in one
Yeah.
of your previous podcasts. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Wendy Smith, the both and thinking, she
Mm-hmm.
does a
Mm-hmm.
really nice job of, as we were talking, and for listeners, listen to the episode with Wendy Smith. It's a really interesting conversation because that either or, that binary thinking puts us into two boxes. It shuts us off from seeing option C or D or E.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
both
Yeah.
and thinking takes us to new places and new options
Yeah.
completely weren't there. How do we help build those habits of mind?
Yeah,
Oof.
I mean, I think they're really tough. I mean, you have to remind people. I mean, I was reading something the other day about unconscious bias training, and the biggest problem with that is it's basically telling people you have bias thinking,
Yeah.
but it doesn't really tell you much about what you could do about it as an organization. It tells you do better, but
Yes.
what could the organization be doing? So whenever you're doing strategic planning, and strategizing, I think the habits in those group meetings are around setting up a structure where people can think as divergently as possible. I just went through an ecosystem mapping process with two of these companies recently, and it was really interesting to kind of push them to the limits of what the future might be. And then you'll have people talk a little bit with, well, how can we do both of those things? How can we be both customer focused and also technology focused? And so then you talk about, well, how would you do that? How can you think of both of those at the same time
Yep.
going forward? Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, part of it is alerting to people. They know that they do this, giving them a few tricks and tools. There's another tool that I'm going to use next session with my group, and it's called Scamper. It's an
Hmm.
acronym. I can't explain it to you very much, but it's a way you kind of break apart an issue, and it's been used in marketing. It's a little bit like design thinking a bit. You really break it down like a problem you're having into these seven different things. Maybe you can insert in the materials the Scamper model. There's a couple of videos that are really good on it.
Oh,
Yeah,
for sure. For sure.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and I
yeah,
also, back to our conversation about technology, I was
yeah,
talking with Dave Day and Jonathan Reams the other day.
yeah, yeah,
David had written a foreword to a book that Jonathan wrote about adult development and leadership. And so we were kind of ideating and having this conversation, and we were talking
yeah,
about how to use technology and leverage technology to aid in development. And when you think about like the Apple Watch, or you think about these other
yeah,
kind of micro reminders, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Nudges. I get most people call them nudges still in
yeah, nudges.
organizations. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And so how do we design technology that make nudge? Okay, where have you seen either or binary thinking today? Where have you
Yeah.
seen it so
Yeah.
far?
Yeah.
You could on any number of different topics.
And that's in the habit, the books, the habit books by all those different people. There's a lot
Oh
of
yeah.
different authors. Yeah.
Little baby tiny habits and
Yeah. Yeah.
micro tiny atomic
Yeah,
habits and
yeah, yeah. Well, it is quite funny because that's why leadership sometimes is a hard thing to talk about in development because,
yes.
and I always use like golf. I say no one says I want to get better at golf. They say I want to putt better. I want to do a 3 foot putt better or a 10 foot putt better. Or I want to use my 9 iron better. You get very specific and even more specific than that. It's my backswinger. But I think there are people in that technology space. So when I went to the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychologists last year in Seattle
Yeah.
conference, there were all the technologies there. And so there's been for a long time, you're on a leader development path in an organization, like at Rolls-Royce, for example. And they will tell you, okay, you said you wanted to work on these 3 skills. Here's some things you might read. Here's some things you might do. How's that going? And I think that's going to become more and more ubiquitous, both because of the technology is available, and second, because our leadership programs have become so individualized. You
Mm,
know, I mean, just like our Apple Watch says, Susan, it's time to stand up, or
yeah.
gosh, you didn't make it very far on your activity goals today. Try
Yes.
again tomorrow. Yeah, it's going to be like that. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
think of how individualized that's become, right? I mean, it used to be a
Yes.
blanket statement, hey, humans, walk X number of steps a day. And all of a
Yes,
sudden
exactly.
now we have this technology that has sliced that up into millions
Yeah. Yeah.
and promoting that behavior and that shift. And no, from a
Yeah.
developmental standpoint, or just building the habit of mind, to your point, I think sometimes what we're asking of people is so large that that might be part of our problem.
Yeah.
Been at this
Hmm.
leader development thing for and similar with weight loss, right? I mean,
Exactly.
people
Yeah. Yeah.
people need to focus on, okay, I'm going to get to the gym 5 days a week, fast until noon, and that's the win, right?
Yeah.
Those two things are the win, and the byproduct might be weight loss, but that's the win. As we kind of begin to wind down
Yeah.
time, are
Oh,
there
yeah.
any resources that you would like to kind of turn
Well,
individuals onto that you found very, very useful in this topic?
Well, one of the groups I'm working with right now is using the book. It's kind of a compendium of HBR articles called Thinking Strategically.
Nice.
So that's really good. There's another book called Reflection, and that's a little bit about spending time sort of having those postmortems in your head with in terms of how something went. A lot of times with people, and you probably do the same thing, people often focus on why the mistakes were made versus what went well. And
Yes.
so by kind of looking at things, you can start picking up and what it felt like when you did it right. What did we do differently there? Oh yeah, that's right, that did really help in our quality of our decision. Yeah, so I think the book Reflection and then the HBR book.
As we wind down, as you know, I always
Yeah.
ask guests what they've been listening to, reading, streaming. What's caught your attention in recent times, Susan, that listeners might want to know about?
I think the big thing I've been reading recently, because I teach a couple of classes on data and people analytics, the other one is data and analytics for leaders.
Mhm.
One of the books is called Data Feminism,
Hmm.
and the other book is called The Equality Machine. Because if we think we can go into the future with only 30%, 25% women being involved in technology, which is going to drive our entire world, we're going to be in a world of
Wow.
trouble, is what it's
Wow.
going to be. I mean, you just can't leave people out. And it's like you said, when you were talking about everyone doesn't need to be a coder. There are so many things that you can understand on different levels, but it means you have to be open to technology. You have to be just open to numbers. What does this mean? What does this look like? Maybe is this an average, or what are trends that we look at? So it's a bit of a mindset change, but I think we have to do a lot more. One of my kids goes to school, and there's only one girl in his computing class.
Hmm.
He's a junior in high school,
Hmm.
and I said that's a failure of the schools. It's a failure of the country here in Scotland, they want to be this digital capital, but you have to think of ways to get everyone involved. You can't make it a gendered thing. And in the 1980s, when you had 30% of computer majors as women, and now you have 11 or 14%, you know that you've done something to dissuade people from entering that arena. But anyway, they're quite interesting in thinking about it. And the data feminism one starts with basically the premise of hidden figures, the idea that women did computing. Women were the computers because there were no computers at that time. And then women started programming the computers. And so this idea that they were out of the whole process is sort of interesting. But anyway, so the equality machine is one, and then data feminism.
I love it. I'll put those both in the show notes. I have not heard of those. Very important. Very important topic because to your point, even just subconsciously, you have these male programmers building systems that, right? And we talk about bias and algorithms and all of these different things.
But it goes even further at this point.
Oh my gosh.
Right? Thank you so much. This was fun. It always goes by so fast.
I know. It flies.
It does. All right.
Bye-bye. This conversation with Susan just goes so nicely with the conversation with Dr. Wendy Smith on her book, Both and Thinking. It's just amazing to me. I need to do an episode, a whole entire episode, maybe a few episodes on cognitive biases, because they wreak havoc at times on our ability to chart new paths forward. And so whether it was the discussion with Wendy Smith or this discussion with Susan today, I just have such respect for how she is thinking about the work, how she is helping others approach the work with greater levels of skill, with an awareness of what's working on them so that they can move past conventional ways of thinking and into new, unique, innovative spaces. So Susan, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thanks for your time today. For listeners, the practical wisdom for me is we're all limited. And that's why we need a great team of individuals that we trust, that we can communicate with, that can help us see more of the whole as we chart our paths forward. Take care, everyone. Be well. As always, thanks for checking in. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.